Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shawty pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shawty pulled up, shooting, they was tryna fake dead. Thug, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me, I'ma sleep on the bunk bed. Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing Zaw with the man. Free cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the model, you know how we play. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. I can't go out like I'm Tony, you can't sneak up on me. I got the whole world in my hands. Sad how we treat the opponents, I'm still undefeated when we talking body and bands. Next like the Memphis, I slide when I land. You try to spin through, had to body your man. All of my bitches be too slant thin. When I sick them on you, they begging you win. Been with the coolin' kid on the FN. I knew I was gon' catch a body at 10. Gotta hop out on feet every time that we spin. Wanna get with my gang called Death to get in. Tryna reach for my chain, you out Memphis and me. Face shot on right, turn the step with the C. First every time, better XIT. Got a day going out like Pac on big. Everybody around me buying green. Knew we big C gang, what the fuck you mean? Everybody you know my team. Still post on the blog like I'm y'all me. Chrome hard hat with the long sleeve. In the road truck, Mars always a freak. If I want a dead, I just pay this shit cheap. He one in the head, no LA paper key. Peep your gang, shit weak. Can't running on me, I'm too slimy and neat. Hey, shout out to TP, he cooked up the beat. Got some tears in the hills, I need to try that with me. Really stood front line, real beef. Tryna slide every day, couldn't eat shit. Sleeping them close on my technique. Gotta buy back the block, cause I run concrete. Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shawty pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shawty pulled up, shooting, they was tryna fake dead. Thug, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me, I'ma sleep on the bunk bed. Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing Zaw with the man. Free cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the model, you know how we play. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. No, can't spell where we stayed. Brr. Big brr, brr.
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family like a Japanese meal. It's Yasup the Hibachi, and none of you niggas can stop me. But can't help but watch me. As promised. You understand? I got caught up in something else yesterday, and we were dealing with some dilettantes. So I felt the need to make a video about the abuse and misuse of scientific data and notions by Sonetta TV. But today we're back on track. You understand? I am the type of person that I try to get as much done that I can that's within my power. And with that being said, let's get back on task. I'm not going to spend majority of my time worried about dilettantes and Afrocentrics and their nonsense. So we're going to get back on task here with The Forgotten Diaspora by Peter Mark. Now, I believe we're on chapter 2, if memory serves me correctly. So it's the chapter about identity. So we're going to have fun with this one and definitely educate our viewers, unlike Sonetta Garfield and the other online churches that run the internet, BHIs included. You know, you look at you buy your kids a toy or something, in the back it says batteries included. Well, that you get the whole package when you deal with the spirit that we're in. BHIs included, Afrocentrics, abos, all of this nonsensical stuff. Let's get back to the education. Let's get back to the literature. We support literature here. With that said, I do have a message from our sponsors.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. a reading rainbow, a reading rainbow, a reading rainbow.
And I also have one request of all my viewers tonight. Just one small thing, if you can just do that for me. I'm not asking you for, a membership to my church or something like that. I'm not asking you for an endowment or anything. I'm just asking you for one easy thing. If you can do this for me before we get started.
Hi, everybody. Time to use your noggin. How do you use your noggin, you say? Well, here's how you use it every day. Use your noggin when you write a letter. Use your noggin when you make it better. Use your noggin when you play guitar. Use your noggin to spot a star. Use your noggin when you make a scene. Use your noggin when you mix up green. Use your noggin to play a game. When you use your noggin, it's never the same. Use your noggin to sing a song. Ask another noggin to sing along. Use your noggin with your computer. Hey, that's Z. What could be cuter? Use your noggin. That's what it's for.
I'm using my noggin.
Are you using yours?
I'm using my noggin. Are you using yours? So I just want you guys, request that you guys please use your noggin, and all the detractors that's watching that don't know how scientific hypothesis works or the realm of science works. We deal with the degrees of possibilities, plausibility, and just remember, it's possible.
It's possible, it's possible, it's possible.
It is possible. So we're about to get into it. Remember, this book talks about Senegalese. So I got a few precepts before we get in here. Some interesting tidbits about the Senegalese and who they are, whatever, who they were said to be purported to be. And it's very interesting things. Post in the resource group if you're a part of them. You got to take them back to Safik. You got to take them back to the foundation, man. You know, these guys want to talk about everything else but the fundamentals, man. Mr. Fundamentals himself is here. So I posted in the group, I said genetics is a powerful tool to demonstrate human interaction and migration. In the 1500s, certain authors would deem the griots or griots of the Wolof territory as Jews, essentially branding them as Levantine migrants. Well, today we have evidence that the Wolof and surrounding people do have Eurasian components, indicating a back migration from Eurasia. Hale argued against this suggestion in the 90s, but the DNA has pointed to a strong possibility of the griots indeed being Eurasian migrants circa 3,000 years before present.
It's possible, it's possible, it's possible.
All right, so with that, of course, this is the book that I got it from, and it basically gives the quotes around 1506. It says, "In this land of the Wolof and among the Mandinka, there are Jews called the Gaul, and they are black like the people of the land, although they do not have synagogues nor practice the rights of the Jews." And here's another quotation. It says, "Throughout this land of the Wolof, Serer, and Mandinka, there's a nation held among them all to be Jews." Most people just, dismiss this. Even Hale, you see Thomas Hale dismissed this in the 90s. But what's interesting about this, according to the African Genome Variation Project, right, they found Eurasian integration into these different groups dating between 3,000 and 6,500 years ago, right? Wolof, Mandinka, the Jola, and the Fula all having these signatures dating to about 3,000 years ago. And this is the book that I was quoting from, The Rise of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in Western Africa. One more quote from David Reich, and then I'll give a quotation from the book Jakhunki. I hope I'm saying that right. I butchered a lot of these names because I'm not a native speaker of any of these languages. So also David Reich, I put in here from David Reich's Who We Are and How We Got Here, David Reich. And on this page here, it talks about the problem is not just that people have mixed with their neighbors, blurring the genetic signatures of past events. So as you go somewhere and you begin to admix with the locals, you hyper admix with the locals, you begin to blur your older genetic signatures that you may have had in the past. For example, case in point, the 8 ethnic Jewish groups, they all share signatures of sub-Saharan African DNA that matches with the Yoruba, which my primer Johnny and the geneticists that worked on that paper pretty much stated. The most parsimonious explanation for that is that Jews were already admixed with sub-Saharan Africans at the onset, before the diaspora, right? They were already, that was already a part of their ancestry during those times, 3,000, 3,500 years ago, around that period. So again, the problem is not just that people have mixed with their neighbors, blurring the genetic signatures of past events. It is actually far more difficult in that we now know from ancient DNA that the people who lived in a particular place today almost never exclusively descend from the people who lived in the same place far in the past. And we know that because we have evidence of that as well with the Shumlaka remains, where they posit the Bantu expansion starting. But they found A and B markers, and these people were genetically far off from what we see today in sub-Saharan Africa as far as haplogroups, paternal lineage, and also even their autosomal makeup is largely different, with them being like 64% basal as African. All right. So, we actually try to teach and educate here and give you guys this source material from the up-to-date science. So from there, let's go to my Kindle, and then we'll get into this book and share information. Shout out to Moore. He told me about this book, and I purchased it as soon as I could a few months ago. And this is the book called Jakhunki, African Ethnographic Studies in the 20th Century. And it just discussed these people that lived in Gambia and the Senegal region, which this book talks about, right? And about them having a tradition of being Israelites. And I think this is around the 13th century, I believe, if I remember correctly. So in this book, let me close that. Well, it says, according to the TBI, the Sia or Sila traced their ancestry to Fodi al-Hassan Sila of Bani Israel. Fodi al-Hassan is a referred figure from Sila, is looked to as their inspirational ancestor. So it goes on. Later on, they talk about who founded the children of Israel. They say it's clearly an ancient center. Some estimates date that it started around the Common Era, 635 CE. Also, it says here the Tariq al-Fatash mentions the Bani Israel and Messina in connection with the Battle of Tenderma around 1496 if 97. It says certain horticultural traces of a flourishing Jewish colony called Bani Israel were discovered, although that was all that remained of these people. The tradition that Fodi al-Hassan Sia was the founder of Bani Israel in Bundu may have originated from the area in Messina described by Tariq al-Fatash, or it may have survived among people connected with or familiar with it. So this is an older book, but it's still good to have that historical reference about these people that at the minimum claim to be Jews and could have been Jews, right? In Western Central Africa, in the Gambia region, Gambia and Guinea region. So with that being said, just want to drop those tidbits, just let you guys know it is possible.
It's possible. It's possible. It's possible.
All right, with that being said, let's get to the book. Let's get to the meat and potatoes of tonight's video. Let's get straight to it. All right, I'm going to blow this up. We're going to get to reading. Shalom, brother. Jewish identity in Senegambia. Identity in Senegambia, identity in the 16th to 17th century. Senegambia was remarkably fluid. Let me blow this up real quick. All right. It says here, an identity in the 16th, 17th century, Senegambia was remarkably fluid. Individuals, as we have both argued elsewhere, often held multiple identities. These identities could be sequential, but they tended to be contextually contingent. This was true of the members of local African societies, but also of Euro-African descendants of unions between African women and European traders who had settled for varying lengths of time along the coast. Contextually determined and potentially multiple identities characterized by Luso-African offspring of the Lancanos, immigrants from Portugal and the Cape Verde Islands, including many new Christians who had settled on the coast and thrown in their lot with local communities. Again, new Christians is a word describing Jews that converted into Christianity. For all of these peoples, identity was actually defined by their profession, by the languages they spoke, as well as their religion and their material culture. Notice none of these things included skin color, because again, this is early on in West Africa. That concept had not broken to what it is today yet. They would be confused if you approached them in that manner, right? So, for example, to be considered a Jula in Senegambia was to be a professional trader and a Muslim and to speak the Manding language. In similar manner, to be Portuguese was to be a long-distance trader, to be Christian and speak Portuguese, or by the 17th century, Portuguese Criollo. In addition, Portuguese traders were distinguished by their European clothing. They armed themselves with European blade weapons, and that's going to be a very important point right there in the next chapter. So they often lived in so-called Portuguese-style houses, that is rectangular, whitewashed houses with verandas. These dwellings constituted physical representations of the owner's social identity. The buildings showcased the individual's wealth and social status, characteristics that in turn helped to establish Portuguese identity. It should be noted that Iberian Portuguese, as well as their Luso-African descendants, and also individuals of African ancestry who exhibited the characteristics enumerated earlier, were all considered in Senegambia as part of the same group. Although having a European parent or grandparent might help to establish one's identity as Portuguese, it was by no means a necessary precondition. Hence, it was possible for Christian traders of African ancestry to become Portuguese. As already mentioned, another striking aspect of social and cultural identity in pre-colonial Senegambia was the fact that people could have multiple identities. For example, a trader, whether of Euro-African or African parentage, might be Portuguese when he was in the Cape Verde Islands. But this did not preclude his identifying himself as Manding when he was back in the Gambia. 17th century written sources enable us to trace the lives of a few wealthy traders and local rulers who were raised and educated in the Cape Verde Islands. These individuals subsequently were identified as Portuguese in the context of political and trade relationships with Europeans. So I just want to point out real quick before we continue reading, these are including African rulers. And it's so important, and it's so important that we do this and discuss these things, because the way slavery is talked about, the way West Africa is glorified as some romanticized kingdom and utopic kingdom where nobody did anything wrong, nobody dealt with the Europeans, they were all just victims of the slave trade. No, these people were integral to the slave trade, and they became partners with people with countries like Portugal and established trade networks with them. That's the reality. That's the history, right? Anyway, these individuals subsequently were identified as Portuguese in the context of political and trade relationship with Europeans. However, in the context of their social and commercial interactions with other Senegambians, they would present themselves and be considered by their African interlocutors according to their local ethnicity. This was the case of Ventura de Sequeira, son of a Timni ruler from northern Sierra Leone. He was raised as Portuguese on Santiago Island and later moved to Cachao, where he taught his Christian faith and literacy to other Africans. In the process, he maintained his Timni identity and high status, and he eventually returned to Sierra Leone as a ruler. Cape Verdeans, free Africans, and even slaves who circulated between islands and the coast were part of a mixed Cape Verdean Guinean world within which fluid life identities were possible and socially acceptable. From the late 17th century, these circumstances permitted African grumetes to become decisive cultural and commercial brokers between Africans and Europeans after the Luso-Africans had lost their ability to serve as mediators. Early written sources documented dual African identities exist, but they are rare, since European travel writers were little interested in these individuals. However, the phenomenon of multiple identities was not limited to an educated elite, nor to Portuguese. Indeed, the social dynamic of plural identities predates the European presence in the region, and it exists even today in southern Senegambia. And a historical example from the Casamance region of southern Senegal illustrates this point. The decline since the 18th century in the number of Banunka living in the Casamance may almost certainly be attributed to their identifying when among outsiders as members of the larger and cultural dominant Jola ethnic group. When they find themselves among other people of Banuk heritage, however, they continue to identify as Banuks. A second example is a product of 20th century urban migration from rural Casamance. This migration resulted in a growing incidence of marriages between Jola migrants and members of other Senegambian ethnic groups, including the Wolof and Mundi. Among the offspring of such unions, persons of mixed Wolof and Jola heritage may present themselves quite as a matter of course as Wolof when they are in the Dakar, but as Jola when they're in Casamance. In the 16th and early 17th century, as we have written elsewhere, membership in Portuguese communities was not determined by an individual's physical appearance. And real quick, I just want to note this, that again, skin color didn't play as much of a factor as it does today as far as identification, right? You know how y'all go around, I'm black and I'm proud and all that. That didn't exist at this time. You know, the Germans did not spread their filth throughout the world yet. All right. It says, what is more in Senegambia, the appellation white applied to wealthy traders regardless of their skin color. In Greater Senegambia, then at the time of early contact with European traders, skin color was not seen as a marker of social identity or status. One may go further and state that neither modern racial categories nor a social hierarchy based upon race would have had any meaning in coastal Senegambia in the 16th or early 17th century. In Europe, too, racial categories had not yet been articulated in a rigid and systematic manner that would come to define race consciousness, especially in Northern Europe. From the end of the 17th century, that development, as many historians have observed, was associated with the expansion of the African slave trade during the 1600s. The imposition of racial categories in the mid and late 17th century Northern Europe would have an impact on the Sephardic Jews and their dealings with African and Euro-African members of their own religious community in the late 17th century Amsterdam. So give some context to that because the book is going to fill you in on that. First, the Sephardic Jewish community was okay with having members that are black, embracing other black Jews and, supporting them. But as Europe become more and more racist and race conscious, the Sephardic Jews begin to adopt the same characteristics as their neighbors, and they begin to impose these things and start to discriminate against their own members, right, of their congregations. So that should be noted. This does not mean that the understanding of color in Portugal and Amsterdam was equivalent to the representation in Cape Verde Islands and Guinea. In Europe, the close association of color with slavery had a significant impact. In the Cape Verde and Guinean world, composed almost entirely of black and mestizo populations, tracing social boundaries was a much more complex operation. So real quick on that note, the association with slavery and color, remember what we covered in our prior episode about a year or two ago, that racism pretty much comes out of European Christendom and the idea of Ham being black or Cain being black and, Negroes being beasts of the field and all that other stuff that came later. That's what those ideas, that's what pushed this racial conscious movement. That's why when you really look at the history of how that word was applied to our ancestors, it's very sickening that you see people trying to glorify it today. It's like, if you think about all of the steps that we took to be called that and have that stamped on us, all of those steps, it's very paradoxical to see people today use the term as a term of endearment or saying something we should embrace. All right. So this was not a concept in West Africa. This is a concept that sprung out of Europe, not West Africa. All right. So it says composed almost entirely of black and mestizo populations, tracing social boundaries was a much more complex operation. Sephardic Jews who were connected to Senegambia, but who gradually came to occupy influential positions within the Dutch Portuguese community, brought aspects of Luso-African identity construction with them back to Amsterdam. At the beginning of the 17th century of the Petite Côte, it was still possible for coastal Senegambians and Sephardic Jewish traders to meet and interact on the basis of their respective cultural traditions without applying preconceived judgments based on physiognomy. Furthermore, the coexistence of the aforementioned social factors, the relative absence of a color-based racial consciousness, and the practice of living multiple identities and of implicitly accepting the idea that an individual identity could be flexible, linked hosts and settlers. They spoke a very similar language of identity, and their interactions from commercial agreements to marriage can only be understood in the context of these shared concepts. So, in short, long story short, these people found commonality between each other. Sephardic Jews and Senegambian, indigenous or Toxin Senegambians found common ground with each other, and they meshed pretty well. That's something you would never learn on Garfield, Sarnetta. They would never tell you this. Because first of all, they probably wouldn't read this, in its entirety. They probably take some snippets here and there. They're not going to sit down and read it like I did. It says it is directly relevant to the situation on the Petite Côte that the early 17th century Jews living in Senegal and indeed throughout the Iberian Empire as well as in Northern Europe often converted their household servants to Judaism without any apparent concern about their skin color. Furthermore, the documented presence of mulatto Jews in Iberia and Amsterdam, and specifically on the Petite Côte, indicates that skin color was not a deterrent to the selection of a mate, and that did not preclude the subsequent incorporation of any offspring into Jewish social and religious community. So yes, they would have their house servants, right? Many of the house servants were not like slaves, right? Other slaves, let me put it to you like that. Their status was a little different, right? But with that said, about these mulatto Jews, the first Jew in North America to ever be recorded in any documentation is in Boston. And he was also described as a mulatto Jew. That was the first Jew ever recorded. I believe his name was Solomon in the Americas, right? So obviously this was a thing. And not all of them were just converts, which ain't nothing wrong with being a convert. I think Garfield started using that word as an insult almost if someone's converted to anything. We're Americana, we quote unquote converted to American culture and traditions and values, right? If you want to go from the Africanist standpoint, I just say I'm American, but using their logic against them, there's nothing wrong with being a convert. But anyway, they weren't all just converts. Many of them were offsprings of Jewish parentage, right? It says here, nor is there any written evidence that the darker members of the Jewish community in Joal and Portugal suffered from discrimination or lower social status. The life of Moises de Mesquita provided a well-documented case of the contrary. There is, in short, no evidence in early 17th century Joal or Portugal of the color consciousness that would gradually come to characterize Northern Europeans, Jews and Gentiles alike from the middle of the 17th century. In Senegambia, social identities were not rigidly ascribed a priori categories based on physical characteristics, as would be the case in increasingly race-conscious Northern European societies from the mid-17th century. Nor were their cultural identities fixed and imposed, a direct inheritance of one's ancestry, as they tended to be in Iberia under the influence both of the Inquisition and of the ubiquitous concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. To the contrary, malleable and plural identities were characteristic of Africans and of Luso-African descendants of Portuguese settlers. In Senegambia, there the Portuguese adopted local African ways of situating themselves within the social cultural space of Senegambia. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Jewish traders who settled in Senegambia exhibited an openness to mixing in readiness and to incorporate both African and Euro-African members into their ranks. In this respect, they were much like other Luso-Africans or Portuguese. In Senegambia and on Santiago Island, some Africans and Luso-Africans were considered to be white, though their skin was otherwise. Might this fact have served to diminish the importance of skin color as a parameter for ascribed status among mulatto members of the early Jewish communities on the Petite Côte? Parenthetically, these Jewish communities were so small that at least at the time they were founded, they may have needed all adult males who happened to be in a village in order to form a minyan. And that's a great point. They needed in another book, I believe it's the Jewish Caribbean, it talks about when they were fleeing, these people are fleeing, they're not able to bring their whole families, they're not able to do anything, they have to start all over. So in order for the Jews to survive, they got to mix and ingratiate themselves with the locals. This is a more realistic story of this. If you let someone like Reggie or Sonetta tell you this story, it's going to be all gloom and doom, right? And it's just going to be there to vilify Jews. But this is what really happened. This is what took place. All right? So they did bring into the fold many African and other Euro-Africans, right? And a Euro-African is a person that has mixed European and African ancestry, right? The experience of dual identities was already familiar to many Portuguese New Christians. After 1497, Portuguese crypto-Jews were accustomed to living both as New Christians and as secret Jews. When the new Christian merchants arrived in Senegambia, the fortuitous conjuncture of identity models that were flexible and contextually determined may have played a significant role in the acceptance of such multiple identities by the wider Luso-African community. In fact, the crypto-Jewish identity pattern that Robert Rowland names dual identity and Nathan Watchell names dual sincerity helps us better to understand the capacity of Luso-African communities to ascribe different identities in different contexts. It was certainly shared by all the Portuguese who lived in the rivers of Guinea. The Christian sincerity, when performing local rituals, finds a structural explanation in the convergence of religious systems. Those new Christians who settled in Guinea, Cabo Verde in the 16th and early 17th century were traders. Senegambian society also enabling traveling merchants to take on multiple identities. In the Casamance region of southwestern Senegal and just to the north in the Gambia, for example, oral traditions recount that visiting traders were adopted by families in the host community. So traders, real quick, something you guys should note, right? That when these traders were coming in from Europe, they were being adopted in. They were ingratiating themselves with Africans. And Africans were adopting them in. African rulers, we read in the last chapter, where they protected the Sephardic Jews. Right? So it says, in consequence, visitors might take on a local identity. Many new Christian merchants in 16th century Senegambians continued to live both as Christians and as Jews, and perhaps on occasion, through this remains to be proven historically, as ostensible Muslims. The case of the two early 17th century Jewish communities on the Petite Côte is significant in another respect. For it represents a transition in identity. This transitional identity model was paradoxical. Portuguese traders who publicly proclaimed their identity as Jews were moving toward a fixed identity. Such an identity, Jewish and not Christian, is, for example, stridently proclaimed in their conversations with local Muslim rulers. Nevertheless, the new public identity was not necessarily exclusive. There is evidence that some Jewish merchants continued to present themselves as Christians when they traveled to regions where they were subject to the Inquisition and risk arrest. In the early 17th century, the arrival of Portuguese Dutch public Jews in northern Senegal may not have changed their relationship to Portuguese or African Christians outside the Petit Code. For instance, Luis Fernandez Duarte, Joshua Israel, had business with an African ruler, D. Sebastião, king of Bosses. Bosses, the present-day it's an island in the Guinea-Bissau. Excuse me, I can't say that name there. But it says here that the king of Bosses was the largest slave trader on the northern Upper Guinea coast. This is a native African, right? You know, so for everybody trying to romanticize it, we played a major role in the slave trade. It's just a fact. But anyway, together with the existence of earlier family links with the king mentioned in chapter 1, this was certainly the primary reason why Israel sought to establish a business relationship with him. Sebastião was at least formerly a Christian, although the Jesuit missionary Manuel Alvarez expressed reservations about his faith. But the Jesuit had no hesitation, describing DeAndre, his Haraf, the second dignitary of the kingdom, and the only one to have a ship to trade with, as a fervent Christian. Significantly, Joshua Israel wrote the king a letter, which he signed with his own Christian name. In his letter, Duarte proposed to take one of the king's sons under his personal tutelage while bringing the youth with him in his travels through the region. This was a form of adoption, a means to bring him into the business. Even though Joshua Israel lived as a public Jew on Petit Côte, he presented himself a Christian in the context of his business dealings with local Christian ruler and slave trader. This was a common situation even in the Terres de Liberté, such as Amsterdam, as Joseph Kaplan has observed. That's in another language. Let's see if it's translated in English. Let me read it here. There it is. The case of Manuel Homem de Carvalho, whose sad fate is discussed in chapter 3, offers another example of the merchant who switched between Jewish and Christian identities as his business travels took him from the Netherlands to Terceira and then to Bahia, Pernambuco, in Angola. As he confessed to the Inquisition after his arrest, in each of these places, he secretly kept the law of Moses, and to hide this, he prayed at Mass and went to confession and took communion as mandated by the Holy Church in order not to be recognized as an apostate. But on the Guinea coast, business was not always the sole point. The prestige that Portuguese Christians had gathered in the eyes of Africans during 200 years of interaction would not be an advantage to renounce lightly. And even though there was a dual or multiple identity model throughout the Senegambian region, there was also an absolute need for Portuguese traders or their descendants to adopt local rules and customs because they were in African rule spaces and depended on African rulers' goodwill. So just as the locals would convert to the Jews or the Christians' traditions, rites, and rituals, the Jews and the Christians would also convert and adopt their customs as well, the locals of Senegambia, the African customs as well. So it worked both ways. And later on in this book, you're going to see that there was even Jews wearing the same piercings and stuff of that nature to be like some of the locals. And also they found some commonality between the traditions. That's what's also in this book. It says, however, at least for as long as they remain on the Petit Côte, the public Jews appear to have renounced their alternate identity as Christians. In this respect, Joel and Portugal represent the beginning of a fixed European identity in Senegambia. Once Portuguese New Christians who had traveled to Amsterdam, undergone circumcision, and begun publicly to live as Jews, brought this new lifestyle to Senegal in the first 2 decades of the 17th century, their capacity and their willingness to assume multiple identities, at least on the Petit Côte, was diminished. As long as the northern Senegalese ports remained as safe places to assume a Jewish public identity, that coast functioned as a location in which the new model of identity was socially accepted by African rulers. There, without sacrifice of status, Jews seem to have succeeded in differentiating themselves from the Christians and being accepted. And the other parts of Senegamia frequented by Jewish traders. As far as we know, the model was not exported. So here in Senegal, they were safe to be Jews, and the way they lived and how they identified, the African rulers were okay with it. Women on the Petite Côte. As we observed in chapter 1, we know little about women in the Jewish communities of the Petite Côte. The trading communities were part of a Luso-African society in West Africa that comprised essentially immigrant men, many of whom lived with or were married to local African women. If any women accompanied their husbands from Amsterdam to Joel or Porto Dial, they are not mentioned in documentation. In fact, immigration from Amsterdam was, for the most part, Costa de Hombres, a man's thing. In Senegal, Jewish men followed the widespread practice of Portuguese in Africa of establishing a relationship with local women, preferably the daughters of local dignitaries or wealthy trading women. Indeed, that this was not a new practice is evidenced by the presence of 5 mulattoes among the early Jewish settlers on the Petite Côte. Some Jewish traders in Senegamia had Euro-African offspring, a fact that is reflected in the anecdotal references found in travel narratives written a generation or two after the arrival of the Dutch Jews on the coast. More detailed records of particular Euro-African children may exist, but if so, we have not found them. They may lie somewhere in the extensive Dutch notarial archives. In the case of offsprings of Jewish men and local African women, the crucial problem must have been how was Jewish identity transmitted to their children if the women were not of Sephardic origin? Parenthetically, one might ask, what role, if any, did notions of skin color play in the determination of status among adult males in the Jewish communities of the Petite Côte? Was the Jewish identity of these African-born offspring inherited through the father? Aviva Ben Ayer's research into the Jewish community in Suriname affords an historical comparison in the late 17th and 18th century South America. Her work demonstrates that there, in the case of marriage between Sephardic men and non-Jewish women of African or Euro-African heritage, identity was passed through the father. It is almost certain that a similar situation prevailed for the Jews of Senegambia. In both Senegal and Suriname, the Sephardic settlers belonged to the Portuguese nation, that is, to the wider community of the Iberian New Christians and Jews. The seemingly heterodox practice of tracing identity through father may in fact be directly derived from this common heritage. Miriam Bodian's study of Portuguese dowry societies in Venice and Amsterdam provides the key to interpreting this practice, demonstrating that the Amsterdam community showed a similar inclination to consider Jewish/Sephardic identity as inherited through the father. These societies, founded respectively in 1613 and 1615, provided dowries to selected poor girls of Sephardic heritage. In Venice, the girls had to be Portuguese or Castilian on the father's or the mother's side, whereas in Amsterdam, as Bodian writes, until 1660, it was assumed that a candidate must have a father of the nation. It is not clear whether the mother was also expected to be Spanish or Portuguese origin. The work of the dowry societies was diaspora-wide. Indeed, among the founding members of the Amsterdam Association, there were Jews who lived in Brazil, and as in Senegal and Suriname, having one parent, even the father, who was of the nation, qualified the candidate to receive a dowry. Thus, one has defined as Danakal on the basis of having a father who was Danakal. Although race existed as a concept, the term itself had different connotations in the 16th century and was not ineluctably linked to skin color. Even in the early 1600s, as Ben Ayre observes, in the context of Suriname, racial notions in the sense of ethnic identity were most closely associated with the concept of Osta Nokaya. This notion was also prominent among 17th century European observers of the Portuguese settlements, both Jewish and Christian, in Senegal. Suriname had the largest Jewish agricultural population in the world, about 1,000 members, far more than the traders who settled in the Petite Côte. Unlike in Senegal, the community in Suriname had settled permanently there, and the population was self-sustaining. In Suriname, and here, there is a parallel to the Petite Côte. European men vastly outnumbered European women. As Ben Ayre explains, many of the Sephardic men fathered children with women of African heritage, either in or outside of wedlock, from the mid-17th century. Females of African descent were key to both the community building and creolization. In Suriname, the Sephardic men brought their African offspring into the Jewish community where the children had slave mothers. They were manumitted. As Ben-Hur writes, the phenomenon of the first generation colored Jews was thus wholly an expression of a patriarchy that suppressed one of the main matriarchal aspects of rabbinical Judaism. In Suriname, as in Senegal, a Euro-African Jewish population could claim Jewish identity through the paternal line. In Senegal, white or Portuguese identity depended upon several factors, including language and profession. Having European ancestry could be a parameter, but it was not essential. The terminology is complicated. In the 17th century Northern Europe, to be Portuguese or to belong to the Portuguese nation was to be Jewish or New Christian. In Senegal, the term Portuguese was sometimes synonymous with Nakayo, but as noted previously, is more often applied to being Christian. Ironically, many of the Christian Lancanos living along the coast were actually new Christians. Jewish and Portuguese Christian identity could and sometimes did overlap in Senegambia. Northern European travelers after the mid-17th century generally referred to African descendants of the Portuguese and Dutch Jews in Senegambia as Portuguese. Yet they often remarked on their dark complexion. These comments reflect the color consciousness that was becoming widespread in Northern Europe and the growing contrast between the attitude and the Senegambian model of identity, in which, as already noted, skin color was not a defining characteristic of categorizing individuals. By the end of the century, European visitors of Senegambia were directly contesting and essentially rejecting the local African identities, which they described with a mixture of sarcasm and disbelief. In 1685, for example, La Corbe described the Luso-Africans whom he encountered in Gambia as certain negres and mulattoes. Wait, they got this in English. Where are we at? Why you put this in Spanish? But anyway, Portuguese. Anyway, we'll read over that. The European rejection of the Senegambian identity model is clearly articulated a decade later by Jacques Lemar. Visiting the Petite Côte in 1695, Lemar is dismissive. He writes of a species of Portuguese, people who refer to themselves in a way because they used to serve and are descended from those who first lived along this coast. From the negresses whom they married were born these mulattoes, from whom turn came even darker ones. So real quick side note here, get my commentary here. This shows you that a lot of people that just because they dark skin don't mean they automatically have, especially the sons, male ancestry that goes back to these places. They could be the descendant of these Portuguese Jews, Sephardic Jews, or just other Portuguese, right? Lemar is actually describing the remnants of the trading communities at Rufisque, Joal, and Port Diao. The passage is revoltingly disparaging, yet strangely the reference they used to serve and are descended from hints at an awareness of the early 17th century practice by Jewish merchants on Petite Côte and an Amsterdam of converting their African servants. The passage also suggests that some of the children whom the Jewish merchants had fathered by African wives or their descendants still lived on Petite Côte, half a century after the last reference to Sephardic settlers at Joal or Porto Diao. By the late 17th century, the former Jewish and New Christian Lancano presence on the northern Upper Guinea coast had significantly declined. The few remaining permanent residents were probably all Euro-Africans, meaning the babies, their descendants were there. As the number of Portuguese living outside of the trading centers of Cachao and Ziguinchor diminished, the religious practice of Luso-African Christians as well as Jews became increasingly mixed with local African rituals. Let me read that again. The religious practice of Luso-African Christians as well as Jews became increasingly mixed with local African rituals. Like I brought up earlier, it wasn't a one-way street. It was a two-way street. You had Jews picking up, Christians and Jews picking up local African practices, and then you had Africans picking up Jewish and Judaism and Christianity from the European migrants. So it worked both ways. I know the people that have referenced this book before you never sat down and read it, but it's okay. Have no fear. Underdog is here. We're going to read it. In the light of the demographic situation, Jews living in Senegambia could only have followed the heterodox practice of passing on Jewish identity through the father. In 1686, in Guinala, President Guinea-Bissau, the French merchant and traveler Michael Joliot encountered a Portuguese trader named Senhor Patricio, whom he described as white Portuguese. And it looks like it says mulatto in Holland, right? Said the man's identity is complex and intriguing. Although biologically of mixed heritage, he is described as white in the context of a coastal 17th century society. The sobriquet probably alluded to high social status rather than to skin color. This suggests that his mother was a well-off trader. Parece is described as Portuguese through his mother, though his mother is Matisse and his father is Dutch. Although Le Corbeil does not specifically mention religious identity, the name Parece suggests that his father was a Dutch Jew of Portuguese heritage. In this context, Portuguese identity is certainly synonymous with Portuguese Jew. If the son was considered Portuguese, his identity had been transmitted through the father. Indeed, Parece may well be the Frenchman's transcription of the rather common patronym Paris. Senior Parece lived nearly 3 generations after the arrival of Jacob Pellegrino on the Petite Côte. By then, only vestiges remained of the Portuguese Jewish communities. Jewish identity in the perspective of African-European marriages. In her study of Suriname, Ben-Hur has documented the heterodox practice of passing on the Jewish identity through the father. The Sephardic settlements on the Senegal's Petite Côte predate the establishment of the Suriname community by 2 generations. The fact that the same practices occurred there indicates that Suriname was not only entirely an anomalous situation. The question inevitably arises, might transmission of Jewish identity through the father have originated at an even earlier date, perhaps among the earliest new Christian settlers or Lancados in Guinea? From the late 15th century, intermarriage did take place between Portuguese men and African women. In the Cape Verde Islands, these unions involved settlers from Portugal, while on the Guinea coast, they entailed Portuguese Lancados. Many of the Lancados were new Christians, some of whom secretly practiced the Jewish religion in Senegambia. Jewish merchants follow similar matrimonial practices to often Portuguese living in the Guinea. That is, they contracted marriages whether permanent or only for the duration of their stay in Africa with local women. Andre Alvarez de Almada, a Cape Verdean and himself a mestizo, refers to the merchant Danacayo named Jawa Faria, nicknamed Ganagoga. In the 1570s or 1580s, Ganagoga lived at the court of Grayo Fulo, the Fulani ruler of Futa Toro, northeast of Senegal, where he married the ruler's daughter. For the succeeding generation, there is the case of the son of the Rabbi Jacob Pellegrino, Manuel Pellegrino, who may have had a liaison with the daughter of a local Wolof ruler. In addition, there were at least 5 Africans among the original Jewish settlers on the Petite Côte. Marriages between new Christian Lancados and African women came to the attention of the Inquisition as early as 1590. In that year, a letter from the Bishop of Santiago referred to individuals who had previously been tried in Portugal by the Inquisition and who subsequently sailed from Lisbon to Guinea. They settled on the coast without having passed through the islands. And they lived as Lancados in Guinea, and many of them are married to pagan women. Some of these Lancados eventually returned to Portugal. The latter group included new Christians who had been banished for their religious orientation, but who became wealthy enough to purchase pardons. This practice was mentioned by the Dutch merchant Peter van den Broek when he visited the Petite Côte in about 1606. Presumably, some of the returning Lancados had families who accompanied them back to Portugal. By the end of the 16th century, there was a small African population in several cities of Portugal. The practice of transmitting new Christian identity through the father, which may have originated among these Lancados during the 15th and 16th century, was probably established in Portugal as well as in West Africa before the foundation of Sephardic communities at Joal and Porto de Al. In fact, several of the original settlers who looked on public Jewish identity on the Petite Côte between 1608 and 1612 were Portuguese Euro-Africans. And in view of the 1590 report of intermarriage between Lancados and Guinea, of Cape Verde and African women, together with van van den Broek's observation that wealthy Lancanos from the Petite Côte were subsequently able to return to Portugal, and intriguing possibilities arises. Might not the Euro-African children of Lancanos who returned to Portugal from the Petite Côte have been among the first Portuguese New Christians who subsequently settled at Joal and Porto de Al? By choosing to settle in precisely those trading ports, they may have been returning to the place from which their mothers came. And I want to just point this out. That means that if you got Jews going into synagogue, Jews going back, that you're getting black Jews circulating. You're getting your African Jews of a darker hue circulating from Europe to West Africa. And they're saying even the first settlers were already Euro-African. You had some of the settlers already Euro-African. So these Sephardic Jews knew of black Jews. They knew of Euro-African Jews. They were familiar with that already. Prior to them coming to Senegambia, they were already familiar with this concept. This wasn't something alien to them. You know, like today, though. Today is alien to some people, right? It wasn't alien to these people. It says here, by choosing to settle precisely those trading ports, they may have been returning to the place from which their mothers came. Having an African family living in Joal and Porto de Al would certainly have afforded social and economic advantages to the mestizo traders. These advantages would also have accrued to other members of the Portuguese Jewish community to which they belong. Furthermore, these matrilineal ties could be another factor that helps to explain the protection that the Jewish traders received from the Teen and the Bersin in Upper Guinea. The practice of establishing kinship ties with local communities was, in fact, common to Portuguese Lancanos, regardless of their religion, as historian Walter Hawthorne has observed. A parallel situation is documented in the works of Everts and Dormont on 17th and 18th century Elmina, which is the Gold Coast. The Euro-African children of Portuguese and Dutch traders and local Akan women were integrated into local lineages. In Elmina, as Natalie Everts has demonstrated, children of white fathers were considered to belong to their mother's lineage. Dormont's focus on the family's histories provided detailed information on the dynamics of European-African interaction, including marriage on the Dutch Gold Coast. He interprets intermarriages between European men and Gold Coast women in terms of social and economic contrasts concluded between the different participating groups. There and very likely on the Petite Côte, marriage and children became part of the conscious strategy by both European merchants and local Africans to secure socio-economic advantage. Two of the mulatto Jews who settled on the Petite Côte are described by an Inquisition informant in 1613 as males Cristianos Novos, or half New Christian. The New Christian, half of their identity would, in all likelihood, refer to their fathers, meaning that their mothers were Africans. These two men, mestizo offspring of Portuguese Jews, by settling among the other public Jews at Joal, showed that they wished to identify themselves as Jewish, whereas the identity of their mothers is not revealed by the Inquisition archives. And in consequence, the possibility that they may have had kin in Joal or Porto de Al must remain a hypothesis. Their paternal ancestry is clear. In Portugal, marriages between slaves and European women sometimes took place. Although marriages between white Portuguese women and Africans were not unknown in the 16th century, they were rare. These official unions led to manumission of the husband and the offspring, as was also the case if the mother was the slave. This means that at least theoretically a mulatto Jew could inherit his identity through his mother, and frequent extramarital sexual liaisons also occurred between free women and slaves. The first generation of returnees to Judaism, along the other members of the two Petite Côte communities, would have had to undergo circumcision as part of the ritual return to Jewish identity. But in this respect, they were no different from the other members of the community. And as the 1612 conversation between the Bersin and the Jews of Joal indicates, a circumcised Euro-African Jew with local matrilateral kin would have been considered an adult, i.e. circumcised member of Joal's Wolof and Serer communities, as well as a member of the adult Jewish community. Now, real quick, takeaways from that is the part about free women mixing with the slaves, because we focus on the father and the African women, but there was also the reverse was happening as well. Free white women or European women, or just free women in general, could wed or get a husband that was a slave. and then manumit him, and of course the children will be manumitted as well. Let's read on. African Jews, and real quick, that was a sister that was very upset on YouTube, and I have to explain this. That she had haplogroup H, and she was so upset that she was mitochondrial haplogroup H, meaning that her female lineage, her lineage goes back to Europe, right? It could have been something like this. You never know. We don't have time machines. We can only use this stuff as proxies to try to find out what actually happened in the past. This could have been the result that you could have descended from a free woman that decided to make a slave her husband, which would free him, right? African Jews in Portugal and Amsterdam. Among the Portuguese New Christians who were of Euro-African heritage, some eventually immigrated to Amsterdam to live as Jews. Their presence in the Netherlands is documented in the archives of the Jewish community. The burial records of the Jewish cemetery of Bet Ham at Ouderkerk, established in 1614, contain a reference to 15 blacks and mulattoes. One of them, a mulatto named Sarah de Algarve, was buried in 1639. Her place of burial, but also her name, indicates that she was Jewish. Her patronym indicates that she had been born in Portugal. She is another example of a Euro-African Jew. But interestingly, as a Jew, she would have transmitted her identity to her own children. Evidence of the conversion of Africans may be found in the record burials at Bet Haim. The crucial factor, as Jonathan Scorch notes, is that these individuals were almost exclusively women. The Sephardim who returned to Amsterdam from Senegal with female Africans as servants and as wives or companions were indeed seen to their conversion. While most of them appear to have been servants in Amsterdam, some of these women may have been the settlers' common-law wives during their stay on Petit Côte. The practice of converting family members and servants, whether these specific women or other individuals, will certainly have applied to the mothers of the mulatto children born to Sephardic merchants on the Petit Côte. This points to a paradox. Second-generation children of your African mothers were Jewish according to rabbinical law if their mothers were Jewish. But all Portuguese New Christians who immigrated to Amsterdam had to undergo a ritual bath or circumcision to be considered Jewish. African or Euro-African women who made the physical and spiritual journey would then have transmitted their Jewish identity to their children born in Amsterdam. This situation points to the fact that in interpreting the cemetery archives from Ouderkerk, one certainly cannot equate black or mulatto identity with servant or slave status. Ben Ayer's research is also of direct relevance to understanding the growth of a population of mulatto or Euro-African Jews in Northern Europe. In Amsterdam, Hamburg, and other cities that were home to Jewish communities, Ben Ayer finds hints of extensive African Jewish presence. Our research confirms these findings. In Amsterdam, Jews returning from Petit Côte brought their African slaves and servants, and some Euro-African children with them. Some of the servants, including both men and women, had converted in Senegal. The formal process of conversion may actually have been achieved on the Petit Côte, where the Rabbi Jacob Pellegrino or his son Manuel possessed circumcision instruments. In some incidents, however, such as where servants were purchased in Senegal and then immediately sent to the Netherlands, formal conversion could only have taken place after they arrived in Amsterdam. In November 1610, Diogo Vaz de Sousa and Estevão Rodrigues arrived back in Rotterdam from Portugal. They brought with them 4 black slaves who had been purchased in Joal and Portugal to work in the service of the financiers Gaspar Nunes, who had also been a member of the Petit Côte communities, and Gaspar Sanchez. It is not clear whether these 4 Africans eventually converted, but if they did become Jews, it could only have happened after they arrived in the Netherlands. Euro-African Jews from Portugal to Senegal to Amsterdam. While a number of African servants were converted to Judaism in Senegal, and others probably after their arrival in Amsterdam, several of the founding members of the Jewish trading communities on the Petit Côte were of mixed African and European ancestry. So I'm going to stop there. The founding members of the Petit Côte, these first people going to Senegal, were already Euro-African. A lot of them were already Euro-African, as we read before, right? They already had Jewish paternal line and African or West African maternal line, right? They already had that admixture. That's why I'm saying the Jewish people were already aware of this. They already understood. The European Jews understood this already. It was already a concept. This was not alien, right? Let's keep reading. It says these men were full-fledged adult members of their community, unlike the situation described by Ben Aaron for the 18th century Suriname. There is no evidence to suggest that Euro-African Jews of Joal or Porta Dial were in any way relegated to lower status. Antonio Lopez, who became Moses de Mesquita, was an important member of the community in Joal. He was among the elders who were present at the meeting with the birth scene, discussed in chapter 3. He settled in Amsterdam by 1620. He soon became one of the wealthiest Portuguese merchants in the city and a pillar of Jewish community. It is likely that the two individuals on the Petit Coat who are mentioned as mulatto half-new Christians, the multiplication of the priori identity categories, illustrates dramatically Inquisition's preoccupation with regularly imposed identities, had been born in Portugal. One of them was said to have been born in Faro, in the Algarve, in southern Portugal, and another was from Cabeca de Vide, in Alentejo, also in the south. Their place of origin may help us understand both their religious experience and the process that led them to the Guinea coast. In fact, at least 2 Euro-Africans came from Faro, an important port town of Algarve. One Euro-African, Diogo de Sousa, was from the house of Luis Fernandez Duarte. Hence, he accompanied the head of the household. He probably had been raised in the house of his protector as a criado. Criados were retainers. They were not slaves, but they were nevertheless obligated to stay in the household. In a situation of a family migration, a criado would naturally follow his master. We know from the research of Tobias Green that in Quebeco de Vida, near the frontier with Castile, there was a crypto-Jewish community from which some Jews migrated to the Guinea coast. Links between Portuguese places of origin and the Guinean destinations may imply a circulation of Lancados and their relatives, as we have argued before. Inquisition records imply that these mestizo new Christians lived as Jews in the privacy of the family or within secret religious assemblies. There is evidence that the conversion of free mulattoes to Judaism was not unusual in Faro. The cases of 2 mulatto women are strong illustrations. In Faro during the 1630s, the name of Fonseca, a 24-year-old mulatta, figures among those accused by the Inquisition of Evora of taking part in secret meetings of the Judaizers. She is mentioned by the historian Antonio Borges as Fora de Maria Felipe, which means the free woman of Maria Felipe. In this context, she would have been the criada of the latter. A Soares, another Euro-African woman, is mentioned by the Inquisition in Olinda, northeastern Brazil, in 1600. She is said to have been a criada a Luis Antunes. The sobriquet suggesting that the same status as a Fonseca. A Soares was denounced for pride in her new Christian identity and for criticizing old Christians. Both of these women not only found protection inside the households in which they worked, but could have been converted to Judaism there. The question arises, in such cases, would not their children have attained Jewish identity in the Orthodox manner? The Euro-Africans and Petit Coat communities, like several other members, may have traveled to Amsterdam to be circumcised and educated in the Jewish faith, but this does not answer the question. Who are the mothers of these mestizo Jews? These women were certainly either African or Afro-European. However, would they have been converts to Judaism, as a Fonseca and a Soares seem to have been? Their conversion would constitute an important step tantamount to their social integration into the religious community. Unfortunately, we have not found any documents that would enable us to answer these questions. Conversion. Let's talk more about conversion. Let's get into it. Conversion, African Jews. In Guinea do Cabo Verde, there were other African and Euro-African Jews besides the offsprings of marriages between Portuguese Jews and Senegalese mothers. A Jesuit document written in 1624 strongly suggests that local Senegalese were being actively proselytized. The letter in question was sent by the Portuguese provincial of the Jesuits to the deputy of the Mesa da Consciencia, ordains a royal tribunal for religious matters. The document reads, according to what has been stated, the majority of the Portuguese people on the coast of Guinea are Dakanakayo. And God grant that they are not pure Jews and that they live with the greatest of ease, and one knows the ill will they have for the Jesuits and what they are able to do here in Portugal and there in Guinea. And at times one has come across the Gentile, pagans, or in general local African people whom they circumcise and who live in the Jews' way. We do not know the scale of these conversions, but Jewish proselytizing is not surprising if we remember that Portuguese and Luso-African Christians in Guinea not only raised their children as Christians, but also tried to convert the African Mumetis who worked with them and whom they often raised from childhood. Some Africans were converted to Judaism in Amsterdam. In 1611, Martin de Lestringa, born in Zealand, reported to the inquisitores of Lisbon that standing in front of the Amsterdam synagogue, he had heard 3 blacks who were bemoaning the fact that their African friend had been converted. And he recalls that when he, the witness, was with the said Portuguese at the synagogue door, at the door were there black men deeply regretting that the said Jews had perverted a black man, their mate. It made him into a Jew. The conversion of blacks may have been part of a broader strategy by Dutch Jews to recruit Africans to help them on the Guinea coast. Later in 1611, the Sephardic merchants Diogo Dias Querido and Diogo Nunes Belmonte, who were among the wealthiest members of the Amsterdam community and leaders of the Bet Jacob congregation, were reported to be actively involved in the Guinea trade with Dutch partners. They have on the said coast of Guinea 5 big well-rigged ships in good order, namely 3 to stay, 2 to come and go, and to trade. They have launches and small vessels to enter the rivers of Guinea. To this business, the said Diogo Diaz has some black men from the coast in his house who are learning the Dutch language, and they are taken in the vessels as translators. These Africans, who were clearly servants, were being instructed in the Jewish law and were being converted to Judaism. Their legal status in Amsterdam, however, would have been free, since slavery was not formally recognized in the Netherlands at this date, as Dinky Honduis, historian of race relations and early modern Netherlands writes, since slavery did not formally exist, there was no formal emancipation or manumission. When Spanish and Portuguese merchants came to Northern Europe, the status of their black African servants was not immediately clear. Querido and Belmonte's African servants were trained so that their patrons could trust them as agents of commerce. Like Christian Grumettes, they were expected to serve as translators who could guide European travelers on the coast. From Amsterdam to Guinea, conversion of African translators and assistants and of servants went hand in hand within complemented trade between Europeans and Africans. So the European Jews were converting the locals of Western Africa into Judaism. This is a fact. This is empirical. We know that this was the case. We have the documents. Right here. It says, whereas Portuguese old Christians who were engaged in slave trade baptized their captives, Portuguese/Dutch Jewish merchants did not baptize any slaves. They did, however, tend to convert those Africans who lived and worked within their households. On the Guinea coast, such conversions may be explained by the fact that a Jewish servant was less of a danger than a non-Jew to betray the rest of the family to the Inquisition. Sephardic Jews of Portuguese origin who settled elsewhere in Europe followed a similar practice of converting their household servants. In his study of Hamburg's 17th century Portuguese Jewish community, Michael Studman Moon Halevi cites the case of one family whose peregrinations took them from Lisbon to Italy to North Germany. The family Alvaro Dennis included a black servant woman named Felipa, who, along with the family, followed the laws of Moses. This practice of converting family servants began in Iberia, while the new Christians were still subject to arrest by the Inquisition. By converting their servants as secretly Judaizing family in Portugal could reduce the danger that their religious rituals would be divulged by servants, and an unpleasant experience for some unfortunate Moranos. One that is recorded in the archival records of Inquisition trials. For the Jews of Senegal, Petitcote, like those living in Portugal, self-protection was a significant motive for converting one's household servants or slaves. The threat, even if remote, posed by the presence further south of the Cachao of church officials who would order arrest and delivery of the prisoners to the Inquisition would have ceased who would have served to emphasize the wisdom of ensuring that all household servants, as well as African interpreters or gomentes, with whom one maintained close personal contact, should themselves be converted to Judaism. Even after they moved to Amsterdam, these Portuguese Jews followed what was essentially a Portuguese model in their relations with African servants and assistants. The practice of converting the interpreters had begun with the earliest Portuguese voyages to Senegal in the mid-15th century, and it was not limited to new Christians. This was part of a general policy with regard to potential partners in trade and politics. In the 1480s, Bumi Helen, or the Jael Bemom, the Wolof claimant to the throne of Wolof, was brought to Lisbon, where he formed an alliance with the Portuguese crown and converted to Christianity. Where possible, especially in Congo, the Portuguese crown maintained a policy of conversion and alliance with the local political elite. In later 17th century Amsterdam, Dutch Protestant authorities adopted practices that had long been common among both Portuguese Jews and Catholics while they were living in Africa. Ernest van den Bogart recounts that in 1629, the Amsterdam Church Council gave permission for the baptism of some mulatto children on the Gold Coast. He adds, however, that not until mid-century did Euro-Africans began to play a significant role as interpreters and middlemen for the Dutch in West Africa. Even though the conversion of Judaism of servants and gomentes is documented during the second decade of the 17th century, both in Senegal and in Amsterdam, the presence of mestizo offspring created quite a different question regarding Jewish identity in Upper Guinea. By 1630, the Jewish population of Joal and Porto Dial had significantly declined, following the return of many of the original settlers to Amsterdam. In subsequent years, the accounts of European visitors to the coast suggest that some of the Euro-African offspring who remained in Guinea even after their fathers returned to Europe continued to identify as Jews. For Jewish merchants who stayed in Senegambia and for their mestizo children, Jewish identity was a question of descent, even though it could not be associated with the supposed purity of bloodline. So in short, in layman's terms, it was more so about who you descended from and not anything else. You know, that's usually our argument with DNA, right? That's usually our argument in DNA. All right, so let's keep going. Portuguese and Sephardic notions of Raka and of black and white. Race and attitudes towards race, as they are socially constructed, have to be understood as they were in their specific temporal context. The Portuguese experience provided the foundation for attitudes among the Sephardic community of Amsterdam. The concept of Raka was closely related to other categories in late 16th and 17th century Luso-African accounts about Guinea of Cape Verde. It should be noted that the term Raka race was in common use at the time. For example, as part of the lexicon of the Portuguese Inquisition and assessment of the purity of blood that was required of candidates for specific posts and honorary titles. This process began to have concrete consequences from the 1570s onward. But the Portuguese raça araca evoked family origin, the roots, either ethnic, social, or religious. The term was not necessarily connected with skin color or other physical features, even if the latter could be signs of a certain social status like slavery. It had a similar meaning to the concept of Nakayo, and hence sometimes an individual may be described as either of the Wolof nation or of the Wolof race or the Wolof caste. Just another individual might be referred to as of the Moorish race, of the Moorish nation, or of Moorish caste. The same applies to Jewish and New Christian identification, including self-identification. The discourse of the mulatta from Olinda Azores is a case in point. She was accused of stating that she was proud of belonging to the caste of New Christians, which, as she asserted, was better than the caste of Old Christians. This was part of the common counter discourse among New Christians, a reaction to the permanent pressure against people of Jewish descent in Catholic society. But this response appropriated the old Christian discourse fostered by the Inquisition in Iberia. The case of Azores illustrates a first response to the ideological persecution that targeted people of Sephardic descent. The Sephardim adopted an assertive discourse on identity, a mirror strategy that used a category of New Christian and therefore the one of Jew. Azores was not an isolated case. In Guinea in the 1560s, within the Luso-African community of Bugando, mocking Christian values was part of a crypto-Jewish sociability. A similar situation can be found in the 1590s in Angola, where the accusation that Gente de Nacal were guilty of the death of Christ was inverted, turned against the old Christians. Hence, he may argue, slightly modifying Stu Moon's, Halevi's, and Scorch's argument that the self-representation of a proud identity was an earlier Sephardic response. A subsequent response in the Netherlands later in the 17th century would be full of application by the Sephardim themselves of the principles of the purity of blood to the Jewish community. The transition to a second stage in which African blood could be a reason for religious exclusion was not a linear path within mixed Sephardic families. The fact that a Euro-African woman like Azores could firmly include herself in the same caste of the nation has deep significance. It reveals the attitude that prevailed within families who came from Portugal or Guinea to the Netherlands, or who lived in northeastern Brazil, an exclusive attitude toward mixed race members. Why is this not being taught? Because this, again, a lot of people want to poop on Jews. They want to poop on Jewish history, and they want to paint this racist narrative, which was not always so. All right? We always try to paint people with a broad brush. As you can see, that these particular Jews, these European Jews, were very inclusive no matter of what color the person's skin was. You know, a lot of these people were Euro-African. A lot of these people did come from African wombs. So that concept didn't come with this particular group until later, when you start seeing the concepts of race and racial consciousness being hammered on the populace. Azores, just like Fonseca, would be considered by their masters or former masters of being the same caste or heterarchical or rasa as they themselves, a circumstance that had deep implications in the transmission of religious identity both in Guinea and in 16th and early 17th century Portugal. This inclusive attitude toward mixed race members is crucial to understand the first two generations of Jews living in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam and Hamburg, a sense of Portuguese identity was increasingly connected with emphasis on one's genealogy. Historians Stu Moon, Halevi, and Scorch have both associated this tendency with the Iberian concept of limpeza de sangue. In Portugal, the origins of this concept were closely linked with the forced conversions of 1496/1497 and the establishment of the Inquisition 4 decades later. In his masterful study of the Inquisition, Nathan Watchell details the development of this idea of a hereditary stain that cannot be effaced by conversion. It is important to recognize the socially constructed nature of the Portuguese concept of limpeza de sangue. This concept, nevertheless, engendered an increasingly rigid identity model that reflects the elements of a caste system. Joseph Kaplan acknowledges that the ideological origins of this concept were not racial, but religious and social. Fernanda Olivio goes further. One point is unequivocally true throughout the peninsula in the modern era. This type of restrictive qualification does not target biological purity in any racial sense that would imply genetic characteristics. To the contrary, the problem is one of an ideological religious nature with a powerful impact on social and political structures. In contrast to a West African model of flexible identity, I like saying that. The West Africans had a model of flexible identity. You know how y'all go around telling people, no, you can't be this because you're black. No, you can't be a Jew because you're black. No, you can't be X, Y, Z because you're black. That is a concept alien to West Africa, and a concept born, created, and distributed from Europe. Let's continue. In contrast to a West African model of flexible identity, this Iberian notion of identity effectively created in a priori lifelong category in which the individual fit regardless of social and cultural factors. This restrictive identity was imposed upon New Christians and Jews alike. In Portugal, restrictive statutes against the New Christians were implemented at the end of the 16th century and through the end of the 16th century and through the early decades of the 17th century. That is precisely at the time that the first refugees from Lisbon were establishing the Amsterdam Sephardic community. Both Stoudmoen Halevi and Scourge observed the historical irony in fact that the Sephardic immigrants to Northern Europe should have appropriated a fundamental idea associated with the Inquisition. Stoudmoen Halevi writes, after they returned to Judaism, those new Christians who had lived as crypto-Jews in Portugal and Spain took for themselves the Iberian concept of purity of the blood, above all as means of emphasizing their pride in their Jewish heritage and their being the chosen. They transformed the concept into pride in their Jewish ancestry and their status as the chosen people. Jonathan Scorch traces a similar evolution of Sephardic identity in Amsterdam. He identifies this process, which he dates primarily to the mid-1600s, with a gradually dawning awareness on the part of the Portuguese Jews and the descendants of their identity as whites, an awareness that led into the effort to deny equal status to African and African Jews. He writes, slaves seem frequently to have been converted, ritually circumcised, and or immersed, and when manumitted, absorbed in some fashion within the Jewish community. Beginning in the 17th century Northwest European countries, the Netherlands, England, these practices began to recede. Why? Why is the book saying it? Because we just read it. They started to adopt these concepts from Portugal, from Europe, about racial purity and whiteness and all that crap. Anyway, one needs, however, to qualify Scorch's use of the term slave, both because slave status was not officially recognized in the early 17th century in the United Provinces, and also because there is a tendency in Scorch's argumentation to consider the term as practically a synonym for black. Many, but certainly not all, African Jews in 17th century Amsterdam were servants. Furthermore, if one expands the category of black Jews to include Euro-Africans, then the two terms do not coincide at all. Why? Why is that? Why does he say that? Because Euro-Africans are people that actually descend from Jews. It doesn't necessarily equate to being a slave. And that's the concept a lot of these Afrocentrics are not getting, that these people are actually the children of these European Jews. That's the part they leave out. Well, have no fear, Underdog is here. We're going to actually read it to you. Conclusion. At the beginning of the 17th century, notions of race were not clearly articulated among the Jews of the Petite Côte, nor was skin color an important marker of identity or social status either for these Jews or for their Senegalese neighbors and protectors. The early Sephardic communities of Joal and Porto Dial did not distance themselves from the prevailing model of identity formation followed by Africans and Luso-Africans in the late 16th and early 17th century Guinea. In this model, as detailed earlier, skin color was not in a priori, regularly determined characteristics, but rather a fluid concept that reflected cultural identity and profession. The prevailing model in early 17th century Senegal, flexible and allowing for multiple contextually determined identities, was similar to the models of the identity in the early Jewish communities in Senegal. Most of whose members had grown up as new Christians in Portugal, where Jewish identity had to be kept secret at the risk of one's life. Once they arrived on the Petite Côte, these Portuguese merchants could publicly proclaim their Jewish identity. Nevertheless, some of them, Joshua Israel, continued to use their Christian identity when they traveled or in their dealings with African Christians. In their relations with African rulers to whom they were entirely beholden or commerce and for protection, these Jewish traders established respectful dialogue, including theological discussions. Early 17th century Inquisition sources give no evidence of discrimination, either between the Sephardic merchants and their African hosts or between the European and Euro-African members of the Jewish community in Senegal. This legacy is a striking contrast to the situation in the Sephardic community of later 17th century Amsterdam, as well as to the clearly discriminatory attitude seen in Jewish community of 18th century Suriname. What happened? What happened in between those times? The adoption of this racial schema that begins to start to show its ugly head. But these early Jews had no concept, and they were very inclusive, and they did not discriminate people just because of their skin color. All right, so hopefully you guys learned something. I want to should we go ahead and knock the next chapter out? You know I can do that tonight, right? You know how we get down. This is a note here. It says, by the 18th century, the term was applied to Europeans to heavily Africanized descendants, Luso African and Portuguese. All right, so hold on. Let me look at the next chapter. Should we deal with the chapter on the trade of swords? Oh, no, that's chapter 4. This is religious interaction of Catholic Jews and Muslims in the early 17th century Upper Guinea. Let's knock this one out tonight. Let's knock this one out. We already did 100 pages. You know how we rock it, man, with pro-literacy here. So let me give you guys a message from our sponsors while I go get something to wet my whiskers. All right? So I'll be right back. You know what I'm saying? I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you guys reaching out, but we're on chapter 3, and it's something we got to speak about.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
All right, real quick. I'll be right back, y'all. Give me a second. And we're gonna knock this other chapter out tonight, I promise. We back, man. I had to take a brief intermission there. Shout out to everybody that came through. I appreciate y'all for reaching out, but it's chapter 3. We got something to speak about. Let's read this. Let's knock this out, man. Religious interactions, Catholics, Jews, and Muslims in early 17th century Upper Guinea. The Jews of the Petite Côte were protected from representatives of the Inquisition by the local Wolof and Serer elites, who were in large part Muslims. The historical context of Jewish-Muslim relations in the century following the expulsion or forced conversion of Iberian Jews sheds light on the relations that developed between the Jews of Senegal's Petite Côte and the neighboring Muslim rulers. The long passage written around 1608 by Sebastião Fernandes Cacaio, cited in chapter 1, clearly indicates that the Jews of Porto de Al enjoyed a measure of protection against Portuguese Christians. The Senegalese ruler who took the side of the Jews was the Teen, the Wolof leader of the state known as Bao. He was a Muslim. It was clearly in his economic self-interest to welcome the newly established Jewish merchants. With their ties to Holland, these men provided competition for the Portuguese and Luso-African merchants based on the Cape Verde Islands. And at Cachao, located in northern present-day Guinea-Bissau, about 200 kilometers south of the Petite Côte, and also for the English and French, who sometimes, with the help of the Locados and Luso-Africans, traded in the king's land. Nevertheless, One wonders whether something more was at issue. Was this ruler consciously following Muslim law by extending protected or dhimmi status to the Jews who had settled on or adjacent to his territory? The dhimmi were non-Muslims, mainly people of the book, Jews and Christians, who lived within a Muslim society. They were given protection and some rights such as freedom of religion, but not to proselytize and freedom to carry out trade. After the 1497 conversions/expulsions of Portuguese Jews, as many as 50,000 fled Iberia. Of these, a significant number, perhaps a majority, immigrated to Muslim lands, including Morocco and the Ottoman Empire. By the second half of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was a preferred location for self-exiled Iberian Jews. An important attraction of Islamic polities was the protection of the dhimmi status. A few decades later, the Portuguese/Dutch Jews in Senegal may also have sought out Islamic states. For the Jewish settlers in Senegal, this would have provided a second motive for establishing their communities north of the Gambia. Besides being geographically further removed from the dangers of the Inquisition, the Jews of the Petit Côte were in a region that was at least nominally under the sway of Muslim states. Recent scholarship suggests that the dhimmi status was accorded to the Jewish traders in the Western Sahara at an early date. Research by Ghislaine Lydon shows that the practice continued in southern Morocco into the 19th century, even though this may also have been the case along the coast of Senegal before the 17th century. There is insufficient historical evidence of social and cultural continuity between medieval or early modern Jewish expansion in the Sahara and the situation further south in the sub-Saharan West Africa to confirm this hypothesis. The early 17th century relationship between Portuguese Jews and Woloffs and Syrians who inhabited coastal Senegambia north of the Gambia River may in part reflect the experience of Sephardic Jews who were protected by Muslim rulers in Morocco and the Ottoman Empire. In Inquisition records, one witness states that the Jews received the king's protection because they paid them payat bam. However, this verb payatar does not mean a regular payment, but rather a gift or a reward for favors in business, something that was rather common among European settlers in their relationship with local rulers all over riverine Senegambia. More important to the evolution of Muslim-Jewish relations on the Petit Côte, however, was the specific Senegambian context and interaction among African groups and between Africans and Europeans. Here, a tradition of host-client hospitality that had long served as a foundation of social and commercial relationships was extended to the Portuguese and to their Luso-African descendants. On the Upper Guinea coast, Portuguese and Luso-Africans generally identified themselves and were identified by the Africans as Christians. But on the Petit Côte, as soon as the Portuguese redefined their religious identity in a public way, that new identity would have had implications for the manner in which they related to their landlords. Once they identified themselves as Jews, these Sephardic merchants established a discourse with their Muslim hosts, including theological dialogue that clearly distinguished them from Christian traders. Discourse between Senegambians and Jews, iconolatry, and iconoclasm. In the early 17th century Senegal, Jews and Muslims carried out theological discussions in which the Jews stressed the similarity of their beliefs and rituals to Muslim court customs. Our knowledge of such conversations comes primarily from Inquisition records. In Senegambia, where the Inquisition was never officially established and where these practicing Jews were never brought to trial, the informants were not themselves Jews, and most of them had not directly participated in the religious conversations in question. A significant part of our information is therefore indirect. Although we do possess some eyewitness accounts, consequently, reports about theological discussions between Senegalese, Muslims, and Dutch/Portuguese Jews have to be treated with caution. These conversations, as recounted by Inquisition witnesses, frequently centered on shared attitudes toward Christian iconolatry. The discussions evoke Christian reliance upon religious imagery, such as wooden statues. For example, in 1612, a witness who reported to the Vicar of Cachao, Bartolomeu, asserted that he had heard from the Moradores, or Portuguese inhabitants of Guinea of Cape Verde, that the Jewish traders of the Petit Côte were deriding Christian reliance upon images. And they, the Jews, said that they were the ones who knew God, and that we Christians were idolaters prone to adorations of sticks and stones. Another witness reported to the same vicar that one of the Jews of the Petite Côte, Luis Fernandez Duarte, or Joshua Israel had expressed virtually the same ideas. Duarte had uttered many blasphemous words, calling us Christians, pagans, and saying that we engage in the adoration of sticks and stones. The focus of both attacks was, of course, the charge that Catholics worship images. This accusation may have had a second level of reception in the specific context of the Portuguese and Luso-African settlers' religious experience. Other Inquisition's records also accuse old Christians, particularly Mancados, of sharing local ritual practices considered to be hentillicus or idolatrous. So remember what we said earlier of a lot of these Christians, a lot of these Jews sharing a lot of the culture and rituals of the local West African peoples. It was a two-way street, not a one-way street. The culture exchange worked both ways. The Jews would pick up some culture from the West Africans, and the West Africans would pick up culture from them. Same thing we're reading here. It says, nevertheless, we think that the Jews needed to clarify their religious position in an official Catholic context because this was the origin of the potential threat to their position on the Petite Côte. The bishop representatives and indirectly the Lisbon Inquisition, we intend to show that there was a fight over religious representations going on that was not limited to a European context. To some extent, this testimony reflects a Catholic obsession with charges of idolatry. One of the questions specifically asked of witnesses by Catholic authorities in Cachao was, do you know whether these Jews expressed blasphemies and heresies to the Catholics' faces and to the followers of Jesus Christ, and whether they say that we worship sticks and stones and are idolaters? In fact, the formula frequently used by Jews for Christians' adorations of sticks and stones refer to Isaiah 37 and 19. According to this passage, the gods of the Gentiles are not gods at all, but works in the hand of man made of wood and stone. This question may in turn be situated within a wider discourse about images, saint worship, and idolatry. At the turn of the 17th century, all of these issues were directly related both to ongoing theological debates between Jews and Catholics and to the Reformation opposition in this aspect of Catholic religious practice. In addition, the discourse reflects to some extent Jewish merchants' awareness that their argument could be adapted to a Muslim audience who would be receptive to attitudes opposed to idolatry. Priests and Catholic missionaries in Senegambia and Guinea de Cabo Verde were themselves in a delicate situation, as they were living among a largely non-Christian population who neither shared their theological precepts nor accepted their religious authority. Church officials were acutely aware of this lack of authority, which severely compromised efforts to counter that they perceived to be Jewish attacks on Catholic doctrine. Testimony collected by the vicar in Cachao included the assertion that and admission that many times these Jews speak public blasphemy against the holy name of Christ, but the Catholics are not able to offer resistance because they are in the land of the blacks, gentiles, i.e. black, non-Christian, non-Muslims. Additional evidence of theological disputation between New Christians and Catholics in Senegambia may be seen in the 1610 report about the Goncalo Gomez. Gomez, a New Christian residing in the Gambia, had engaged in theological debate centered on the Old Testament, which he quoted at length, both in Latin and in Hebrew. This evidence of this use of the Old Testament as part of religious polemics to express Jewish or crypto-Jewish faith. If anybody doesn't know what a polemic is, it's a work that's vehemently attacking someone. Anyway, it says if we define Marrano identity as a fluid state and not as a rigid position between Jewish and Christian religious feelings, there nevertheless existed points of tension. This tension appears to have diminished with the possibility of being a public Jew. The question of image adoration in Africa, as well as in Europe and America, was one area in which this tension expressed itself. A rupture in the behavior took place with the rejection of the crucifix and the images of the saints and Mary, sometimes taking the form of iconoclasm. The emphasis of public Jews on an anti-idolatric discourse was also evidence of one of the main points of the rupture within the previous Marrano situation. Anti-iconolatric discourse becomes cathartic. for those who have recently rejected their previous crypto-Jewish condition. That discourse expresses the acceptance and assertion of non-reconcilable boundary within the new model of identity. By the early 17th century, Portuguese commercial activity in Senegambia was no longer exclusively organized from the Cape Verde archipelago. Mainland traffic was centered at Cachao. Many of the Jewish and New Christian traders, however, did business with Dutch vessels. This illicit trade represented an economic loss for the old Christians and a few new Christians based on at Cachao and then the Cape Verde Islands. The latter group, therefore, had both religious and economic motives for seeking to curtail the involvement of Sephardic merchants in the trade from the Petit Côte. On more than one occasion, locations from Cachao visited the local rulers of the Petit Côte to try to convince them to evict their Jewish clients. The Petit Côte encompassed territory belonging to 3 different Senegalese states. To the north, the important Wolof state of Kayar extended to the trading center of Rufisque. Less than 50 kilometers further south, the king of Baal controlled the village of Porto Dial. Between the Porto Dial and the Gambia, the village of Joal belonged to the Wolof Serer state of Sine, ruled by Bersine, also referred to the 17th century sources as the Berbersine or king of Joal. Baal was separated from Sine by a river, known to the Portuguese in the 17th century as Rio Sereno. This river, which Andre Alvares de Almada described as small, pequeño, was sufficiently important to figure in descriptions in some maps of the era. Almada estimated the distance between the 2 trading towns as 4 leagues. The Senegambian rulers were not swayed by the Portuguese argument that Jews should be prohibited from settling or trading along the coast. Indeed, from their perspective, their chief interest was to protect all sorts of traders, regardless of nationality or religious affiliation. The resulting largely unrestricted acceptance of foreign traders was in some sense analogous to the practice found further south in the Casamance and the Mande-influenced Lower Gambia of offering a form of self-conduct to visiting traders even in time of conflict. The Jewish merchants of the Petit Côte were also aware of this situation. Through conversations with local rulers, they sought to secure their position. One strategy they used was to emphasize areas of congruence between Muslim and Jewish doctrine and ritual. This is what I was telling y'all about earlier. And I have to highlight that. They would point out certain things like, hey, your customs and culture are similar to mine, right? Preserved among the records of the Lisbon Inquisition. As a detailed account of one such conversation that took place between several members of the Jewish community of Senegal and the Berbersine or Bersine. The witness, one Samayo de Torres, resided in Cachao. His testimony is highly significant, as Torres was clearly present at the meetings he describes, along with a group of Christians, Moradores Natera, who were trying to carry out an order of Portuguese factor of Cachao to arrest the Jews. At this meeting, Torres identified several of the Petit Côte Jews whom he knew by name. All were from Flanders, i.e. Amsterdam or Rotterdam. Luis Fernandez Duarte, Geronimo, Felipe, Moise Mesquita, as well as Diogo Martins. These traders, accompanied by 5 or 6 men whose names he did not know, had met with the Berbersine. When he, the witness, went to meet the king of Douala to arrest them, the Jews, the said Jews were present, and when he witnessed, destroyed them verbally and told the king to deliver them to him so that his port should be good and put in order. They, the Jews, asserted that the king, that we Catholics were pagans and that we worship stone and sticks and that we seek harm to them because they followed the way of Moses in the language of the blacks, Musa, who is Moses in the language of the blacks. And he knows further that they presented themselves to the king as initiated and circumcised like the king himself and the other black people. So again, they pointed out that, hey, Jewish culture and some of these local African cultures are the same, whether it be Muslim or just a regular African culture. They all circumcised, right? It says this passage is clearly based upon eyewitness testimony. The detail goes far beyond the customary references in the Inquisition sources to Jewish condemnation of idolatry. In particular, the mention of Moses, whom the king visited and identified with Moses, clearly refers to a specific conversation. Furthermore, Torres' testimony depicts the Jews as using discourse that shows sensitivity not only to the king and his people as Muslims, but also to local African culture. That's what I was telling y'all. Local African culture. Why? Because many of these Jews were familiar with local African culture. Because again, just as Jews were converting local Africans, the Jews had to learn the cultures and rights and adopt a lot of the cultures and rights of the people there. Right? So let's get to it, man. It says the reference to Musa implies some familiarity with Islamic tradition. It also asserts shared traditions between Muslims and Jews, and it implicitly situates that Jews as followers of the book of religion of the book. The reference to circumcision implicitly associates Islam and Judaism, but at the same time, it refers to the widespread Senegalese practice of male circumcision. Right? The widespread Senegalese practice of male circumcision, which is very old in sub-Saharan Africa, which I believe is just leftovers from the Eurasian population that came in. But that's for a whole nother topic. Anybody doubting that, we can have that discussion. We can debate it or whatnot. You know, I'm always here available to debate anybody on that. And with that being said, just know one thing, man. It's very, very possible.
It's possible. It's possible. It's possible.
All right. So, continue reading. Among non-Muslims in Senegambia, circumcision is the ritual expression of achieving adult status. Henceforth, the Jews, for the Jews, emphasizing their own circumcision is implicitly to identify themselves like their hosts as adults and to differentiate themselves from the uncircumcised Catholics, who are ritually still children. In this context, the reference to Catholic iconolatry is clearly part of an effort to present similarities between Judaism and Islam. This was a defensive strategy which also amounted to a counterattack by the Jews following the strong negative discourse about them made by the Christians. This argument also serves to deny the existence of common ground that might distinguish Christians and Muslims from local Gentiles. Catholics were concerned that Jewish discourse might discredit them before both the Muslims and the Gentiles. The Jesuit missionaries in Guinea who sought to convert the Gentiles tried to precisely fight their idolatry. This sin was considered a definitive characteristic of the local religions. Missionary discourse against idolaters and idolatry was now turned against the Catholics by the Jews. In this war of religion and trade, the Jesuits even accused the Jews of selling black Christians, Gentiles, to African kings, though they would not have been alone in this practice. So the author points out the irony because, you know, Jews and Christians would have done that as well. And Muslims, right? Whether black, white, European, African, and whatnot, they all played a part in that, right? So the next segment, idolatry, new Christian and Jewish accusations. The Jewish accusations of Christian idolatry is frequently recorded in Inquisition charges, both in Portugal and in Portuguese overseas empire, in cases brought against new Christians who were suspected of being covert Jews. In Portugal, Christians were frequently called Gentiles by new Christians. The Old Testament category of the Gentile influenced the discourse of Jews and Judaizing new Christians. So, for example, in April of 1616, a new Christian named Diogo Dias Ferreira, living in the town of Leiria, came to the attention of the Lisbon Inquisition. Ferreira was married to a Crista Velha, and Crista Velha means old Christian, named Ana Antunes. He had previously been imprisoned by the Inquisition. Following the act of faith, he was released with the stipulation that he wear the penitential robe. He and his wife evidently no longer lived together, but at that time when they still cohabited, they engaged in a mean-spirited fight over who would pay the rent. In the course of his marital spat, Ferreira allowed himself an outburst that landed him once again before the Inquisition. He told his wife to go ask her relatives for money since he was going to give her anything, and besides, because he wasn't going to give her anything, and besides, All of the old Christians are descended from a dog, and they worship sticks and stones. And it was they who arrested Christ and blamed the Jews for killing him. And I am a descendant of Jacob, who is more honorable than all your relatives. That's funny. It says here that the contradiction between Catholic reliance on the religious images and Jewish rejection of these images as a form of idolatry engendered a dramatic gesture by one recent reconvert to Judaism. In 1612, Manuel Holman de Carvalho, a new Christian, arrived in Amsterdam from Portugal. There, under the influence of several leaders of the Jewish community, including Geronimo Carvalho, decided to become a Jew. This was quite possibly the same Geronimo who, under the name Jacob Pellegrino, sailed from Amsterdam to Senegal later in the same year to become the rabbi of the Jewish community of the Petit Côte. Given Pellegrino's likely role in the Carvalho conversion, and in the view of the single-age Jew attack on Catholic idolatry in their discussion with local Muslims, also in 1612, Carvalho's subsequent action is particularly illuminating. In 1620, Carvalho was arrested in Angola by a visitor of the Inquisition, and his subsequent testimony undoubtedly obtained under torture or the threat of torture. Carvalho admitted that when he arrived in Amsterdam in 1612, he possessed a wooden statue of Our Lady of the Rosary. This statue depicted Mary holding a Christ child in her arms. When he converted to Judaism, Carvalho, who had come to believe that one should neither venerate nor even possess such images, burned this statue. Carvalho's act, typical of the religious fervor of the newly converted, mimics the original Old Testament act of iconoclasm, recounted in Exodus, Moses' destruction of the golden calf. Carvalho himself expressed the conviction that one should neither venerate nor even possess religious images. For this refugee from the 17th century Portugal, the act may also have contained an element conscious of otherwise of symbolic opposition to the act of faith. Here, instead of the Catholics burning Jews, a Jew burns a representation of the most sacred Catholic image. For Portuguese Jews, the destruction of the Christian religious images was necessarily a symbolically charged act. Describes similar action, the destruction of images of the crucifix by the 17th century crypto Jews in Portugal. Marco Nunes da Silva writes, to destroy the crucifix is for a new Christian to thereby destroy that which it represents, the faith that oppresses and kills. Symbolically, the destruction of this image of Our Lady of the Rosary constitutes an attack on the Catholic faith and on the fundamental theological tenets. Carvalho's religious drama would have another act. After his arrest by the Inquisition in Angola, he was brought to Brazil for trial. There he was sentenced to the public penance, wearing the San Benito. This episode was not an exceptional one, even in Angola. In earlier records during the Inquisition inquiry of 1596 to 1598 in Luanda, a new Christian named Ayres Fernandez is reported by different witnesses to have broken one arm of the crucifix of several African statues he had purchased in Congo. One of the informants states that the destroyed arm was the short vertical piece above the junction where the title of the crucifix ought to be. The accused explained his action. Because under the old law, there wasn't an open cross, only the T-shaped cross, similar to the one he uses as a pendant. Furthermore, in early 17th century Portugal, several Inquisition trials concerning profanation and destruction of sacred objects, for instance, in Alentejo, gives evidence of a common practice that the Counter-Reformation Church was eager to fight. Moving on. Idolatry, Christian accusations, and debates. New Christians were not alone in facing the threat of Inquisition. Should they express or act in anti-iconolatric ideas? In 1606, a Castilian Catholic goldsmith named Gaspar Lopez was denounced to the Inquisition in Lisbon for denying church teachings about miracles. He was accused of having argued that the saints that are upon the altar are only stick of wood and they cannot work miracles, and that saints should not be worshipped nor reverenced because they are wooden saints. Even within the church hierarchy, it was recognized that the use of religious images could lead to iconolatry. This problem is illustrated in a detailed account by a highly educated priest of credulousness among the members of his own rural parish. On April 29, 1619, Duarte Correa, the 70-year-old prior of the church of St. Pedro in the region of Alenquer, confessed to the Inquisitor and Visitor de Manuel Pereira, Father Correa had presented an Easter sermon in which he remonstrated against his congregants' beliefs regarding sacred images in the church, fearing that he had perhaps been too critical of the cult of the saints. Father Correa sought out the Inquisitor to protect himself from any negative repercussions to his own sermon. Father Correa's sermon had sharply criticized the attitudes of an ignorant and credulous congregation, or we might say the manifestations of popular religion, attitudes that demonstrate the fine line between faith and sacred images and idolatry. The sin of idolatry, worshiping the creation of God instead of God himself, contrasted the true cult latria. Catholic sensitivity to charges of idolatry is reflected in the Inquisition's attention to Jewish discourse on sticks and stones. Father Correa's testimony reflects a serious problem that confronted the church. The contemporary reader is likely to sympathize with Correa's attack on idolatry, but in early 17th century Portugal, counter-reformation propaganda was rather focused on preventing anything that could denigrate the virtues of sacred images. The priest had remonstrated to his congregation that they should not bare their chests with the statues, but rather give them as much veneration as they should give to the saints that the images represented. And he told them that the images did not possess either virtue or sanctity, nor more than in that they represented or were figures of the saints, and that the images were simply of wood, stone, gold, or silver. And that if the crucifix that stood at the other altar of the same church should fall and break into pieces, that image would not feel any pain whatever, and that he would immediately have another image made in a better form. Correa further expresses a subtle but crucial theological point when he distinguishes between veneration of the sacrament and references for images of even the Holy Virgin. And if after the confession were to go before the image of Our Lady that stands at the altar, he would offer his devotion, or not expressing at the station the distinction that properly exists between the adoration of the Holy Sacrament and the reverence of the images of the saints. In other words, while the host at the moment of the communion is deemed to become the actual body of Christ, sacred images, including that of Mary, are representations rather than corporalizations of the divine. The highly educated Father Correa thus found himself in a position of denouncing idol worship among his congregants while taking care not to call into question the legitimacy of the sacrament of the host. At the same time, the priest had to avoid rejecting either church dogma about miracles or the Counter-Reformation's reaffirmation of visual representation of the saints. This final point meant that he, as a member of the clergy, was called upon to walk a theological tightrope. Father Correa's awareness of the presence of idolatry among the more credulous and unlettered Catholic believers reflect how widespread was the belief and practice of idolatry. It was precisely an awareness of Christian idolatry or its semblance that elicited the attention of the Jewish merchants of West Africa in the discussion with Muslim Bersin on the Senegal's Petite Côte. Next segment. Idolatry, Jewish accusation. 17th century Jewish religious philosophers also focused attacks on the perceived idolatry of the Catholic ritual. Jonathan Israel describes the increasingly self-confident tone of anti-Christian polemics among members of the Sephardic community shortly after 1600. In particular, Israel discusses the writing of Elihu Montalto, a Judaizing Marrano who lived in France and Italy. Montalto, who in 1612 became court physician to Marie de Medici, attacked Christianity as a superstitious and idolatrous. This, in Israel's words, was part of a more general intensified counter polemic against Christianity. The Jewish discourse on Christian idolatry was well known to the Portuguese Inquisition in a 1630 codex that belonged to the Francisco de Castro, Inquisitor General. A number of texts were compiled. Among those texts, we find a brief treatise that demonstrates how those of the Hebrew nation who live in Portugal are only outwardly Christian actually living as Jews and rendering the maximum possible harm to the old Christians. The resume of chapter 5 reads, they, the Jews, maintain that the doctrine of Christ is idolatry, and they consider the Christians as worse than idolaters. They also think they should refuse to form either alliances or peace treaties with the idolaters that we are, but should rather convert them from their idolatry. And when they see an idolater who is in danger, they do not aid him. But these Christians, worse than idolaters, they deprive them of all means for saving themselves. A number of Hebrew commentaries on the Talmud and rabbinic glosses are quoted to prove the assertions, the main quote being Book 1, the Book of Knowledge of the Mishnah Torah of Moses Maimonides. They cite many passages from the Talmud and about this. Rabbi de Moses states in the book Manda, etc., chapter 9, the following words: Christians are idolaters. Close cooperation with Christians or idolaters being excluded, the way was open to some proximity between Jews and Muslims, as we find a testimony recorded in Olinda in 1621 about Antonio Rodriguez Andrade. At the time Andrade had left Olinda and traveled to Angola, he says that he would sooner save the Muslims than the Christians. Some Jewish writers extended their charges of idolatry to the core of the Christian message. Saul Levi Motera, a student of Montalto and himself one of the leading intellects of the Jewish community in Amsterdam and a noted anti-Christian polemicist, composed his Tratado da Verdade just prior to the 1660. He writes, the third point is the conclusion of our primary subject, which is the difference that exists between naturally occurring objects and artificial objects, i.e. those created by humans. That natural objects have virtue and inherent quality, and artificial ones have none. And consequently, there is an equivalency to those imaginary things, the instruments of the contemporary idolatry, which do not embody in themselves any inherent virtue or property. In the books of the New Testament, instruments of mental idolatry, which teach respect and adoration for an imaginary mental image. Mortetta interprets the worship of images as the material manifestation of a more fundamental problem. What might be called the ontological falsehood of Christian doctrine, beliefs rooted in the New Testament are patently false. He argues as the worship of images. Just as material images constituted the basis of Christian idolatry, so too, according to Mortetta, the New Testament was the mental instrument of this intellectual idolatry. The rejection of images, while rooted in the Old Testament and, of course, in Torah, and while it provided a significant common ground with the Amsterdam Jews' Dutch Calvinist partners, has theological implications that reach beyond the matter of the artistic representation of iconolatry. This philosophical attitude is common to Jews and some new Christians in the 17th century Europe, Africa, and America. In theological conversations with Senegamian Muslims, Jewish traders stressed their own iconoclastic tradition. By so doing, they emphasized both their distance from Christian ritual and a significant area of doctrinal similarity between Judaism and Islam. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to view the Senegamian Sephardim as decrying image worship in order to curry favor among their Muslim hosts. For Senegamian Jews, the rejection of image worship was defining an aspect of their religious devotion. In this respect, their approach is quite similar to the situation of Nathan Wachtel has observed from the 17th century Mexico. Wachtel notes that the rejection of image worship, often accompanied by expressions of scorn or mockery, was one of the most fundamental elements of Marrano religiosity. The Jews who had settled in Senegal, like those in Mexico, were Sephardic of Iberian origin. Their Judaizing New Christian contemporaries in Portugal, too, were characterized by militant opposition of Catholic image worship. In his study of crypto-Jews in 17th century Portugal, Marco Antonio Nunes calls attention to the frequently voiced criticism of Catholic idolatry. He cites the example of one of Inés Mendez, who, viewing a procession with the Holy Sacrament passing in the street, is said to have exclaimed, "Oh, these people are barbarians. They consider as God a crumb of bread." For Judaizing New Christians of Portugal, as for the Jewish cousins in America and West Africa, the rejection of religious imagery as a form of idolatry served both as a critique of the Catholic ritual and through its philosophical implications as an attack on the central tenets of Catholic belief. So much the better if this critique also provided a theological basis for cooperation with trading partners, both Dutch Protestants and Sinhalese Muslims of the Jewish merchants in the diaspora. Conclusions. The Sinhalese context of African-European relations. The broader historical context of African-European relations in the century following the expulsion or forced conversion of Iberian Jews illuminates more fully the social and political significance of relations between the Jews of the Senegal Petite Côte and the neighboring Muslim rulers. These relations can only be understood, however, in a double socio-historical context. There is first the development in the 17th century of a newly assertive Jewish identity among the Sephardim of Portuguese heritage, an identity based in part upon the rejection of Christian rituals and religious imagery. This attitude in turn enabled the Jews of Petite Côte to initiate a discourse with local Muslim rulers that emphasized the existence of common ideas and practices between Islam and Judaism, circumcision, iconoclasm, and the Bible, right? The book. Second, the specific Senegalese context, notably a tradition of landlords who welcome foreign traders, may explain the decision of local rulers to protect their Jews. Contemporary sources, including Sebastião Fernandes Cacaio, descriptions from 1608, as well as testimony given before Vicar of Cachao in 1612. But also the Cape Verdean trader Andre Alvarez de Almada's narrative of 1594 clearly indicates that the Jews of Porto Real enjoyed a measure of protection against Portuguese Christians. According to Almada, in the neighboring state of Salem, the Bear Salem was called by its people the father of the white man. This title corresponds to political tradition according to which the king had the duty to personally assure protection of the white man, whom he calls my white man. So again, you had local blacks protecting Jews from Christians, right? The statement from Sebastião is worth citing again. And the Portuguese seeking to kill them and expel them from the place ran a serious risk because the king took the side of the farmer and he told the latter that his land was a market where all kinds of people had a right to live and that no one would cause disorder in his land or he would have their heads cut off. So this king of Bersalem, right, or Bersalem, he was willing to go to war with the Portuguese or with the Portuguese Christians and whatnot for his Jews, for the Jews of his land. He was willing to go to war for that. Very interesting, very illuminating. It says here, it is evident that at least two local Muslim rulers, the king of Porto Real and Bersin, extended to the Jews the same rights that they gave to all other traders. Central to this discourse is not the specific religion of visiting merchants, but rather the fact that his market should be open to everyone. Local rulers set the parameters for commerce in their own territory. In other words, the religious relationship between the Portuguese Jews and the local population must be situated within the broader social and political context. What might be termed Senegamian market tradition, as well as within the context of European-African relations on the Sinhalese coast. When the local ruler, the team, declares that the Portuguese may rule over the sea, but he controls the land, he is not simply making a territorial claim. He is also reminding the foreign traders that they have to respect the rules of sociability as defined by him. In his realm, as he states, all people are free to come and trade. Throughout coastal Senegambia, markets were a place where diverse peoples, regardless of religion, language, or the polity they belong to, were welcome. In the 17th century, Senegambian trading towns were characterized by an extraordinary degree of cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. European visitors attested to this situation in the Gambian/Casamance trading communities of Albreda, Garegia, and Mentong. The cultural pluralism, as we would term it today, and openness of these trading centers was also found in the coastal communities of Porto Real and Joal. Nevertheless, we do not know to what degree this pluralism openness led to religious and cultural intermixture between the Jews and Muslims on the Petite Côte. To the south, in the pre-colonial Gambia and Casamance, even in time of conflict, merchants were often granted safe conduct so that they might continue to trade. This tradition appears to have been a regional phenomenon, one to which the teen adhered when he warned the Portuguese not to attempt to when he warned the Portuguese not to attempt to harm those Jews trading in his realm. Local Senegamian customs of extending hospitality to foreign merchants and ensuring their safety were extended to the Portuguese and to the Luso-African descendants no later than the 16th century. In the 17th century, the Jewish settlers of the Petite Côte enjoyed the same status as Monday merchants bringing captives from the Upper Gandia as the Faloup or the Jola traders being beeswax from the Casamas. And as generations of Luso-African traders who settled on the coast from the Gambia sought to Bissau, both the teen and the Bursin were interacting with their Jewish merchants on the basis of established social relations on the Upper Guinea coast. The protection enjoyed by the Sephardic communities of the Senegal was part of an established local tradition of contact, tolerance, and cultural mestizaje between diverse peoples. All right, we knocked out 2 chapters today. We're 120 pages in. And now we rock it, man. We represent literacy here, man. We all about reading, grasping the understanding. And as the scripture says, understanding what thou readest and all thou getting understanding. So when we come back to continue The Forgotten Diaspora by Peter Mark, dealing with the West African community, the West African Jewish communities, we will be, I believe the next chapter is on swords. I thought it was this chapter. Yeah, right here, the blade weapons trade in 17th century West Africa. So that will be the next show, next episode. We will deal with chapter 4 and possibly 5. Like I said, we're going to finish this book. You know how we rocking, man. We actually deal with literacy here. So yeah, so we'll do 4 and 5. And then we have 6, chapter 6, in the conclusion. I will try to knock both of these out on the last episode. But the next episode will be chapter 4 and 5. And what you'll be learning is the blade weapons trade and how integral it was to the Sephardic Jews and to the local Africans, and how these local Africans were dealing with Portugal to get these blades to essentially war with each other, right? And get an advantage. Then the Luso-African ivories. We're going to be dealing with that. And then the last chapter is the latter years, right? What actually happened to these communities afterwards. And then we're going to get a conclusion of the whole book, starting at page 216. So we'll be finished pretty quickly here. It's not a hard book to read through for me, just the language barriers here and there. But we're going to finish this book. Unlike these other groups, they don't read books at all. But here we believe in literacy, right? So with that, I'm going to conclude this. I hope you guys enjoyed the literature. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. Hope you guys learned something, man. We'll continue to dig and dive into this history, this West African / Jewish history. You said a good bit of history can really get a visualization of what's happening. Yeah, it's like reading books to me is like watching movies, because I always visualize or try to conceptualize and visualize what's going on, man. I appreciate everybody for reaching out. But next episode, we got something to speak about. All right, we out of here, y'all. Peace. Shalom. And I'll see you guys next time. YAP.
Big brother. Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shots to pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shots pulled up, shooting, they were trying to fake dead. Fucked up, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me on the sleep on the bunk bed. Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing all with the man. 3 cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the model, you know how we played. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. I can't go out like I'm Tony, you can't sneak up on me. I got the whole world in my hand. Sad how we treat the opponents, I'm still undefeated when we talking body and bands. Next flight to Memphis, I slide when I land. You try to spin through, had to body your man. All of my bitches be too slant thin. When I sick them on you, they begging you in. Been with the coolin' kid on the FN. I knew I was gon' catch a body at 10. Gotta hop out on feet every time that we spin. Wanna give with my gang called Death to get in. Tryna reach for my chain, you out Memphis and me. Face shot on right, turn the step with the C. First every time, better X I T. Got a day going out like Pac on big. Everybody around me buying green. Then we big C gang, what the fuck you mean? Everybody you know my team. Still post on the blog like I'm y'all me. Chrome hard hat with the long sleeve. In the road truck, Mars, I was a freak. If I want a dead, I just pay this shit cheap. You one in the head, no LA paper key. Peep choke gang, shit weak. Can't running on me, I'm too slimy and neat. Hey, shout out to TP, he cooked up the beat. Got some tears in the hills, I need to try that with me. Really stood front line, real beef. But on the slide every day, couldn't eat shit. Sleeping up close on my technique. Gotta buy back the block, cause I run concrete. Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shot to pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shot pulled up, shooting, they was trying to fake dead. Thug, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me, I'ma sleep on the bunk bed. The Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing Zaw with the man. Free cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the model, you know how we played. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. No, can't spell where we stayed. Brr. Big brr.